I am Jennifer Isabella.
And I'm Keith Johnston.
Your co-host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, we're joined by senior analysts David Mutter and Jonathan Roberts to discuss autism-friendly hiring practices. Welcome both.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Gentlemen, thanks for being here. We're going to get to the broader topic of just inclusivity overall. But I want to hone in on this idea of employees with autism. Why are we talking about this subject now?
Well, I think the first thing is, let's level set what is autism for those who aren't familiar. The American Psychological Association defines it as difficulties with social interactions plus restricted and repetitive patterns and behaviors or interests. Also, sensitivity to sensory input like light and smells is a common trait. And so when you're talking about autism in the workplace, sometimes it's a discussion on traits with autism that can be strengths in the right environment, like that restricted interest I mentioned, maybe in a topic that leads to extreme depth of knowledge. And maybe that depth of knowledge is what you're hiring for. And other times the discussion is more about reasonable accommodations, like ensuring an employee is placed where there isn't sensory distractions or managers becoming more effective communicators to bridge those communication gaps. So that is kind of level setting what is the background here. And what we see is that autistic people are disproportionately unemployed, although they disproportionately enter STEM fields in terms of their training, their education. And like you said, we're in an employment constrained or maybe entering an employment constrained recession. I know IT labor shortages have been a trend for many years now. So that's what brought this to my mind. Jonathan, if you have anything more you want to add to that?
Yeah, you guys invited the future of work analysts to this conversation, so I'm going to talk probably about some of the trends and set some of the context here about why this conversation should be happening now, right? So there are some forces that are converging on the talent space that create almost the perfect storm in terms of this topic and how we solve some of those challenges, right? So we have first this talent crisis. Some people are, calling it the shortage for high skilled labor, especially in the tech fields. And then we also, at the same time, have this graduating from diversity, equity, inclusion theater, right, to the actual understanding, practice, and integration of inclusion and equity work for organizations, right? So organizations are asking, outside of your MLK events and your, and all the different kinds of ways we were approaching diversity before, how do we really integrate inclusion into our workspaces, right? And then on top of that, we have this expanded understanding of belonging as an employee metric. So all of those things are happening right now kind of set the stage perfectly for this particular conversation and gives ways to what this conversation can lead to for organizations in the space of inclusion and inequity.
So that's an amazing kind of backdrop to why we're having this conversation right now. I'd love to get into some of the specifics of, how to be friendly to either prospective employees with autism or current employees. So can we maybe talk about, is there a specific guidance or advice that you're giving leaders who are interested in autism-friendly hiring right now?
Yeah, in our report, we outline 3 key steps. They focus around, one, creating a pilot plan to attract and retain autistic talent. Secondly, adjusting your interview process with more structure, less ambiguity. And then number 3 is fostering a supportive and structured work environment. And we have a variety of things that we explored in those, but just to drill down into one of those, one example is that autistic job candidates are more likely than the general population not to respond to a job posting if they don't check every box described there. And so to be broad, that's also true of many non-autistic people as well, but again, disproportionately affects this population. And so you want to be very clear in job postings what is truly required, what's optional, and what doesn't even need to be in there to begin with. A company called Ultranauts we interviewed is a great example of this. They don't list education and years experience and as a requirement in the job postings. They found the validity of these in predicting job performance is significantly lower than the structured interview process and work sample tests they employ. And as a result, they've had tremendous growth, but 40% of their employees don't have a college degree. And out of curiosity, I looked up their job postings and I compared how they describe it to similar job postings for similar jobs at other companies. I actually had a clear understanding of what kind of person would be qualified for an Ultranauts job than other companies, despite those two omissions. And so just to be clear, like you can still value education, you can value years of experience as part of the decision-making process. The point is, don't require them as a candidate filter. And again, while this may disproportionately affect autistic job seekers, it can also affect other people as well. So this point is not merely pro-autism, it is a pro-human point. And fixes like this all around improve your ability to find the talent that you need.
David, I was fortunate to be exposed to a great little agency, Autonomy Works, that has an autistic workforce and focus on data management and ad operations and things like that. What are the specific skills that that autistic people have that are really valuable to the workforce right now?
So, and in terms of skills, that's hard to generalize because everyone's a unique individual. But we do see, for example, like I said earlier, a narrow interest in a topic may make you have a very much more depth of knowledge in that topic, whereas your coworkers may have more breadth. And I think the key point here is thinking of cognitive differences in your team staffing. They're going to bring different perspectives in how you approach a problem. Someone with a large depth but very narrow amount of knowledge brings one thing. Someone with a shallow but broad knowledge brings a very different perspective. And having that mix on a team can produce new innovations, new ideas that you wouldn't have with a more cognitively homogeneous team.
Another thing I could add here is through writing these two reports that will soon be published, we had the honor, honestly, of interviewing some fantastic people, folks through a couple of different organizations who have been through or are going through some of these autism kind of friendly hiring programs for organizations. And aside from the fact that they were lovely people, they were highly passionate, deeply engaged, and committed to the success of their teams and their organizations, almost in a way that we haven't seen a whole lot lately, considering everything going on in our global workforce. If you're looking for where the employees of passion are, if you're looking for the employees that are still highly committed to finding paths to solutions, it's these folks. And again, yes, I know that's kind of anecdotal, right? Our sample size was small. We interviewed dozens of folks, and a common thread which is really about how committed these folks were to the work. So I can definitely say that.
Jonathan, we've talked about having inclusive hiring practices in a lot of our research. We've noted and we've seen that there's huge benefits, in having great practices and expanding how we perceive our talent and the kind of people we want to bring in our organization. What are some of the examples of inclusive hiring practices, whether that be autistic talent or other, that companies are really getting to the big benefits of this approach?
That question is a great question. David mentioned earlier that autistic people really thrive with more structure and less ambiguity, right, in the hiring process. So they like to know, how many stages and, maybe some of the questions prompted, things like that. And I'm thinking to myself as we were having these interviews, I'd like that too, right? That's something that would benefit, I think, everyone. Who doesn't love less ambiguity in such a kind of a stressful scenario like interviewing for a new job, right? So if these are barriers for just people and we remove those barriers, we'll see more and different kinds of people kind of getting to the finish line. Here's another example, right? Because even this falls outside of people with autism, but when we look at self-promotion, if your interview relies so heavily on self-promotion and the ability for someone to talk about themselves, well, culturally, there are a lot of places in this world where that's considered really rude and boastful. And we actually, frown on those kinds of things. So if your goal is to get the best possible talent for a specific role, but you put in a barrier like leaning too heavily on self-promotion, that's going to be a problem for more than just people with autism. It's going to be a problem for a lot of different cultures or genders, or those kinds of scenarios, right? So inclusive hiring is really about understanding all different kinds of people, and people with potential for the role, and removing those barriers to the finish line.
Yeah, I really like what you said there, Jonathan. I think the way I like to frame, at least in my mind, is that when you see something that doesn't work for a particular group of people, in this case, we're talking about autism, odds are that problem affects many others as well. It maybe disproportionately affects this group, but you don't want to get hung up on we're only solving for this one group. You really are solving for humanity as a whole, and this one group just help bring attention, bring to light the problem that you may have been overlooking.
I like that because we can get overwhelmed with, being inclusive for all. And then sometimes you're so inclusive for everybody that you're not inclusive for anyone, right? And so, focusing on the, autistic talent is just, it's kind of the door into more inclusive practices, right, Jonathan?
That's exactly right. And that's what we found over and over again. These organizations we interviewed would start in a specific kind of autism-friendly hiring program or initiative, and then people outside the program would be observing and say, hey, we want to try that, or we want to talk a little bit more about how that can maybe impact what we're doing over here. And we started to see that seep into other parts of the organization as best practice. And that's exactly right.
Yeah, and also roles as well. It would start with one role, maybe oftentimes a technical role, and we see success here, and then organizations expand to other roles. And like one example to give that, like I think Jonathan was alluding to, was like one company had a program to help autistic hirees adjust to office life, which is foreign. And if you're someone who doesn't like, or if you're someone who really likes sameness, and now you're in this very different environment, that can be especially stressful for you. And they had great success, but then they also started to realize, who else has some difficulties adjusting to the office? Military veterans who go from that command and control culture of the military, which is necessary for the military, to an influence culture in the office, also have a very difficult time adapting to office life. And so I don't think as a one-for-one, just take this thing for autism and make it just copy-paste it for veterans, but just some tweaks of that. They were able to then also provide better support for veterans entering the private sector workforce.
This is great. Guys, what are a couple of examples of companies out there, whether that's autistic talent or other, that are just doing a great job? And, what do you think is kind of the hallmark of their success?
Well, so one example is Microsoft. Many applicants hired through Microsoft's autism inclusive process had previously applied multiple times for the exact same role and didn't make it past the phone screen. And as Jonathan noted, these candidates didn't sell themselves as much as other candidates. And this is something Microsoft feels hurt them in the older process, why they didn't make it through those phone screens. At SAP, they had a finance administrator who was hired through an autism inclusive program. This fellow automated invoice creation to make his job more efficient. And this innovation was so valuable, SAP's finance department incorporated his innovation across the entire global enterprise and awarded him their most prestigious internal award for innovation. And we've seen others cite improved communication for the managers as a benefit, improved leadership skills. And this is an overall improvement. It's not just, hey, they're better at communicating and leading autistic employees. They become better communicators and better leaders overall. So there are halo effects that benefit the whole organization. And I want to stress here, I mentioned these big tech firms. Your reaction, our listeners might be like, well, we're not an SAP, we're not a Microsoft, we're not as big as them. This works for organizations of all sizes. I mentioned Ultranauts earlier. That's a small tech consulting firm. The Jewish Federation of Cleveland has a program, or has had a program like this for summer internships. That's a small nonprofit serving Northeast Ohio. So any organization can do this, though how you do it, how you approach it may depend on your size and type of organization. Obviously, how SAP executes a program is going to be very different than the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. We've also seen non-technical organizations like Ford automaker, right? You don't have to be a tech firm to do something like this.
Yeah, I can also add, looking back through some of these notes for the research, AMC, right, the largest theater chain, has a program called the Focus Program. Furthering opportunities and cultivating untapped strengths is what Focus stands for, and they provide employees with autism opportunities for competitive employment, wages, benefits side by side with other associates, and also Home Depot, right? Home Depot, they partner with an organization called Ken's Crew, but they have placed almost over 1,000 employees in the Home Depot network with autism to roles, right? And they specialize in job training skills, coaching and mentorships, and also job matching, right? So inside tech, outside tech, all levels of size for organizations. This is happening.
Are there any sort of common missteps that you have observed, or just even in your conversations with leaders who have gotten it right, maybe their second or third time, their third go around, as it relates to standing up hiring programs, or even reaching further into what the work environment is once, someone lands at that company? Is there, any lessons learned that you could share too?
One lesson learned is talk to organizations that have implemented something like this and learn from them. There are also third-party consultants that can help you build an approach. And so one feedback that I've heard is maybe a fine way to start using a consultant, but oftentimes the feedback is that they may overbuild what you need. So if you go down that route, the feedback we hear is aim to transfer the competency in-house and shrink it down to something that works for your organization's unique needs. Another issue that came up was don't overlook the work environment. There's one company, they really focused on the recruitment and interview process and didn't think enough about the work environment, at least in their first pass. And that was to cause some issues, which they then addressed in later incarnations. And this reminds me, I've been reading about D&I, kind of the history of D&I and theory behind it. And something I read was in the 1980s and 90s, companies were actively seeking to recruit women and racial minorities on the heels of civil rights, but didn't think about the work environment. And a trend that I've read back then was successful recruitment paired with retention sieve due to new recruits landing in a poor work environment. So that's why our 3 steps, it goes from recruitment all the way to work environment.
It's so funny you speak about that like it's so long ago. A lot of organizations are still trying to figure out that environment piece and not just the diversity pipeline piece. But yes, that's exactly right. And another thing I'll add is organizations that are doing this well have also mastered a really comprehensive and deep listening muscle, right? Here, it's one of those things where we don't know what we don't know. And when we build out a program like this, there are going to be things that come up that we didn't anticipate or didn't think about. And so there should always be a mechanism for listening, for different kinds of listening as well, right? Maybe different kinds of employees don't respond well to surveys or one-on-ones or panels, right? So the idea is to employ different types of listening so that you can really get good feedback and then act on that feedback and make the kinds of modifications that are being requested. So be ready to iterate when you implement a program or project like this.
Jonathan, I loved the phrase you used earlier I think you said harnessing untapped strength. That's so good. I feel like the last couple of years, our eyes have been opened up to these subjects. DE&I, inclusivity. We were focusing on autism today. 5 years from now, where are we with all these practices?
Now you're talking my language, Keith. So 5, and that's a hopeful number, but let's say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when we get this right, this is no longer a conversation that we have to have. This is no longer a podcast episode, right? Because the idea here is to do this so well, it just becomes part of who we are as an organization. It's just how we do business, right? If I could break that down into 3 steps, right? How we get from this being a podcast episode to us talking about something else, right? Step 1, understanding and elevating different kinds of workers. Historically, we've kind of cleared the path to success for a specific kind of employee or a smaller group of employees. So the idea here is to understand who else is here at the table and what other folks need to be successful, whether you're talking about people with autism, whether you're talking about people with more kind of general neurodiversity kind of conditions or contexts, or women, or young people, or older people. I mean, right? So you expand the table. Step 2, and we talked a little bit about this before, is listening, finding out what barriers exist for different kinds of people and what would really allow people to thrive. Because the whole idea here is you want a workforce that's not just there, that's not just hanging on, that's not just doing the tasks that are in front of them, but they're thriving. They're leaning into change. They're tilting their head to the side and looking at challenges and markets and problems different ways. That's the goal here. And then step 3 is to kind of work these conditions and these modifications and these kind of different aspects of working into the culture, right? And then Angelina Jennis is our culture analyst, and I've had a lot of conversations with her about none of this is real until you actually bake this into who we are and how we do things organizationally. And that will eliminate the newsworthiness of what we're trying to do here.
David, you obviously had a great passion for this research. You have 2 reports coming out. What are the couple of takeaways you want our clients to take from this research?
Yeah, the one takeaway is, I think, awareness. There are probably many employers who never thought about this particular issue. And it's a great way to address labor issues and workplace issues that you may be confronted with, which leads into number 2 that I think Jonathan and I have been very much promoting, is that this is beyond just autism. It's a starting point. I think of it as a stepping stone or a foundation stone for broader universal human design.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Best part of my day.
Yes, thank you. It's been a wonderful time talking with you.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.